Good evening, everybody. We're so happy to have here Mr. Joshi. We're quite honored that he has agreed to give this little talk with us. Mr. Joshi, welcome. Welcome to enlanochedelostiempos.
Good to be here.
In the panel, we are also joined by John Diaz. John is a very good friend of En la Noche de los Tiempos, and he's going to help us a little bit with the translations, and he's an honorary member of En la Noche de los Tiempos. Welcome, John.
Welcome, everyone.
Okay, and Ricardo Montero, que todos ya conocen. No, Ricardo es pues nuestro representante en Ecuador. Rick, bienvenido.
Muchas gracias, Clau.
Okay. With no further ado, we will welcome Mr. Joshi, and we would like to start this interesting conversation about horrors from the sea. And we would like to ask Mr. Joshi, the Mary theme manifested itself very early in the life and works of H.P. Lovecraft. Could you talk about where did this interest come from?
Well, it must have started very early. I think initially we should say that it's a mistake to think that Lovecraft had some sort of fear or horror of the sea. He actually liked going to the sea, and I'll explain that in a little bit. He could hardly have helped doing so because he grew up with the sea and the ocean very, very close to him. As we know, in his very early youth, when he was an infant, 1890 to 92, 93, he lived with his parents, of course, in a suburb of Boston in Massachusetts. And Boston, of course, is a great seaport, the great harbor there of Boston, which Lovecraft knew very well. But then early in 1893, his father took ill, as we all know, and Lovecraft, therefore, with his mother, went back to his family home in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, for those of you out there, Rhode Island is the smallest state in the United States, very, very small state. And at least half of it, I would say, is surrounded by water. The bay, the so-called Narragansett Bay, leads right out into essentially the Pacific, the Atlantic Ocean. So Lovecraft grew up with this maritime environment all around him, and he actually liked going to the sea. I think it is underappreciated that Lovecraft was kind of an early environmentalist, by which I mean he came to hate development, industrialization, overbuilding. He liked the natural landscape, and he liked the quiet rural landscape. And that included bodies of water. He didn't want them to be polluted or to depart from their pristine condition. And so he went to the sea quite often. There's a funny picture, in fact. There is a picture somewhere of Lovecraft when he was about 30 years old, I'd say. Actually at the seashore. We're not sure where exactly. I think it was in Massachusetts, again, in the Boston area. And he's actually in a swimsuit, if you can believe it, with those old-fashioned swimsuits, that go from here down to his legs, striped swimsuits. That's what they wore then. They didn't want to reveal too much of themselves, even men, let alone women. And there is an actual picture of Lovecraft out there. So he was there, and he took his wife, future wife, Sonia Green, to the sea once in 1922. A place called Magnolia, which is again in the northern, just north of Boston, and they sat right by the edge of the water, and she started telling him this little horror story that she wanted to write in this same in this environment that she was noting, and she did write the story. It was called Horror at Martin's Beach. But as she was telling this story, this idea of the story to Lovecraft, he got all excited and says, "Yes, you really must write this story." And so she was so gratified by his interest that she kissed him. And Lovecraft says this is the first time he had been kissed by a woman since he was like 10 years old, which is odd in itself. I mean, Lovecraft, we all know Lovecraft. He was a little uncomfortable around women and didn't have much to do with women. But anyway, so and then he got all flustered when she kissed him, and he says, "Oh, nobody will ever do that to me again." And she says, "But I fooled him." She did kiss him later again when they got married. Anyway, so in terms of the interest, it was always there. And as we see, Lovecraft's essentially his first or second story of his mature period, Dagon, is all about the depths of the sea. I think you mentioned even that his very early stories, when he wrote when he was 7 or 8 years old, The Little Glass Bottle and The Mysterious Ship, are also sea horror stories, and very crude, of course. But for the work of a 7 or 8 year old boy, they were pretty good. So even then, his interest was there. But yeah, that interest really persisted throughout his life.
It's quite interesting to know that Lovecraft didn't hate the sea, which is this image that it's going around that, and he was quite adept. I don't know. I even think just the story that you told us about Sonia and Lovecraft was, well, he find it quite romantic even.
Absolutely.
So,
then there was a time, I think this was a little later, like 1927, the Massachusetts coastline in the eastern Massachusetts is really fascinating. I mean, you could go right along the edge of the coast there, north of Boston all the way up to Maine, and Lovecraft did that once, in fact, probably several times. And some of the towns that he enjoyed the most, that he found most fascinating, were these coastal towns, not only Boston, but then the great town of Marblehead. He adored Marblehead. Today it's still a gorgeous colonial town, but right on the ocean there, right at the harbor. And even north of that is a town called Newburyport, which was the ultimate inspiration for The Shadow over Innsmouth, and we can get into that later. And there's a spit of land that's kind of almost basically a peninsula, where the town of Rockport and Gloucester are, those two towns in Massachusetts. And Lovecraft once stood there right at the edge of the ocean, at the shore there, and he says, "There's now nothing between me and Spain," by which meant no landmass, of course. There's nothing but water between me and Spain. And so it was a fascinating thing. What Lovecraft really liked, I think, was the sea as a sort of boundary between the human and the non-human. I think that is what compelled his interest, because Lovecraft, he was a city person. Let's be honest. I mean, he'd like to think of himself as some sort of rural person, but he wasn't really. He was raised in the city. He spent all his life in a city. But he liked to go to these places that were kind of thresholds between human civilization and something else, and that was triggered his imagination, because he could imagine what is out there. It looks empty. There's nothing there, or is there? Maybe there is something there, and that's what intrigued him.
So like an empty vessel to fill with all his stories, his monsters. I don't know.
That's right, because Lovecraft, as a scientist, Lovecraft was a scientist. He was well versed in biology and chemistry and physics, astronomy, all these sciences. He knew, of course, as everyone does, but he knew that land is really fairly small part of the earth. What is it? Like 4/5 of the earth is water, right? Is ocean. So human habitation is actually a relatively sparse thing in terms of the total realm of the earth. And so that allowed his imagination to roam in terms of what might be not on the surface of the earth, but down below. And it's interesting to note that even in stories like Dagon, and also The Temple, and certainly The Shadow over Innsmouth, Lovecraft doesn't postulate a single monster, like a vampire or werewolf or anything like that. Not one single monster, but a civilization, right? All these stories deal with an entire culture, a civilization that is non-human and that is dwelling there, maybe still dwelling there in the depths of the sea. And what that represented for Lovecraft was a sort of, it was a way for Lovecraft to show that humanity is really not in charge of things. We think we control the earth because we seem to be the dominant species on land, but there's so much else that we don't control. And maybe that, I mean, Lovecraft in reality didn't believe, of course, that there was anything actually down there, but it was a part of his philosophical perspective of diminishing human achievement, human control, by postulating in fiction the existence of other cultures that could easily overwhelm us and destroy human civilization if they wanted to.
So you mentioned A Shadow of Innsmouth, so which is one of my favorite stories. Lovecraft have this Robert Olmsted rather has this ambivalence towards the sea. He is like quite attracted to, but it also repulses. So this ambivalence. So you just say that Lovecraft didn't have really these negative feelings towards the sea, but what do you think Robert Olmsted felt? So, what was his conflict?
Well, okay, what Lovecraft did have an ambivalence for was seafood. That's a very different thing. He claimed he was, he made him physically ill. And who knows? I mean, that's quite true. We have several stories along that line. When he was in Manhattan, for example, in New York City, there's a place in Lower Manhattan called the Fulton Fish Market, which is where all, this huge quantities of seafood gets bought and sold, from coming in right from the harbor there. And Lovecraft made the mistake of going there, and the mere odor of the fish, which he despised, let's just say, caused him to lose his lunch, if you know what I mean. He became physically ill. Who knows why that happened? Maybe he had a bad reaction to fish as a child or something like that. We don't know. But ever since then, he never ate fish. In fact, there's a story that somebody wanted to test whether Lovecraft really didn't like fish. He was just making it up. So they surreptitiously put little pieces of fish in a salad that Lovecraft was eating, and without his knowing about it. And so when he started to eat this salad, he said, "No, there's something wrong here. This salad must have gone bad." So it was not something that was just in his mind. He clearly had some sort of physical reaction. In terms of Olmsted, again, yes, what we see is this incredible ambivalence of what is, basically a civilized human being, a person who is bred in human civilization, encountering not only the fact that this alien species that is, half fish, half frog, whatever you want to call it, but realizing that they too have this underwater civilization where they have dwelt maybe, many thousands of centuries and will continue to live there. And Lovecraft even implies that this city down right below Innsmouth in the water is only one of many cities all around the world, underwater, that are populated by what he calls the deep ones. So it's not just Innsmouth; it's they may be everywhere. And he has that old fellow named Zadok Allen tell the narrator this long story in dialect, a really brilliant piece of writing, saying, these people could easily, overwhelm humanity if they wanted to bother. It's like they couldn't even be bothered to destroy us. It's too much effort for them, but they could do it, and that just shows how fragile our hold on this earth is. But yeah, there's a tremendous ambivalence in that final reaction that Olmsted has, and it's a matter of legitimate debate. When he recognizes that these alien creatures that he's been trying to run away from with such diligence turned out to be his own relations, that he has this biological and hereditary connection to them, he goes back there and resolves to join them. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that they are less horrifying than he thought? Or does it mean that his own mind has been corrupted such that he now welcomes becoming a monster just like them. It's you know, who knows? People have taken different views on that point. I personally think that Lovecraft meant us to be even more horrified at this mental change that goes on in Olmsted's mind, where he vows to, you know, go back, make peace with the deep ones, and then himself go down to the ocean and live forever down in that unpronounceable city down there. Yaha and the fly, I think it is, something like that. And basically, you know, it achieves a kind of immortality. And I'll tell you, it's very interesting from the perspective of religion. I'm studying religion a lot right now because I'm actually writing a world history of atheism. That is my big project for the next several years. I've written a good bit of it already. And Lovecraft inspired me in part to write this book because he himself was an atheist. We all know that. And he made some very cogent arguments on the subject. And the end of The Shadow over Innsmouth, I take to be a really vicious parody of Christianity. What is the essence of the Christian doctrine? It is eternal life, is it not? Jesus, the death of Jesus grants us eternal life. That is the core message of Christianity. And what is the end of The Shadow over Innsmouth? He says, you know, Olmsted says, and I will dwell in that lair of the old ones in wonder and glory forever. And if you read that passage, you recognize that is a parody of the 23rd Psalm, which has some very similar language of living forever. So Lovecraft is undertaking this really, you know, satire on Christianity by postulating an eternal life, certainly very different from what we think of as eternal life in the Christian system up in heaven.
Speaking of life and death, in a lot of Lovecraft's correspondence, he mentioned suicide, I guess, due to his financial circumstances, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And in one of his stories, Salaphis, one of the narrators, one of the main characters, he winds up dying or drifting in the river. He's a vagabond, a homeless person. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that sometimes the sea attracted Lovecraft as a source of suicide, as a possible way to end his life and his sufferings?
There are a few moments in Lovecraft's life where he claims that he did contemplate suicide, and that the water imagery is interesting that you mentioned, because the first time that we know he thought about it, at least by his testimony, is at the age of about 13 and a half, basically 13, 14, when in 1904, when he had to move out of his birthplace and move to a smaller house. And that for Lovecraft was a very traumatic experience because he had become so attached to that birthplace. Lovecraft was actually more attracted to places than to people. That was just the nature of his personality. And so he says, oh, when I had to move out of this house, I would go on long bicycle rides to the Barrington River, which is somewhere, you know, east of Providence. And he says, I thought of just, you know, falling in there and achieving the oblivion that I had before I was born. So that, yeah, the water imagery and suicide do get connected in that regard. I don't believe there were many other cases in the rest of his life where Lovecraft seriously contemplated suicide. I just don't get that impression. But he did, in that at least one instance, he did link the thought of suicide with water as a peaceful way of ending life.
I would like to go back to Shadow over Innsmouth, which is my obsession. So what happened after the Shadow over Innsmouth? How come Lovecraft drops the ocean maritime theme?
That's a good question. Well, I think part of it has to do with the fact that he actually wrote very few stories after that. I mean, original stories. He wrote down a lot of revisions and whatnot, and we'll get into one of them in a bit. But he wrote The Shadow over Innsmouth in late 1931. Now, this was a period when Lovecraft was having real trouble, not, well, writing, but also in self-confidence. Earlier that summer, at the Mountains of Madness, which he thought was his greatest work of fiction, had been rejected by Weird Tales magazine. That was a shattering blow to him. In fact, later on in life, he says that rejection basically ended my fictional career. It's horrible to think about that, but that's Lovecraft was not very confident of his own abilities. He just wasn't. I mean, that's just part of his personality, and he didn't take rejection well. At about the same time, a leading publisher in New York, G.P. Putnam's Sons, also rejected a collection of his stories, and that would have made a huge difference in his reputation if they had published that book. So then he wrote The Shadow over Innsmouth, which itself was a difficult story for him to write because he tried in all sorts of different manners and none of them worked. And so he just went back to his old way and wrote this story, and was not at all, didn't think it was actually a very good piece of work. So after that, what did he write? He only wrote Dreams in the Witch House, Thing on the Doorstep, The Shadow Out of Time, a great story, and The Haunter of the Dark, and none of which really involved the sea to any significant degree. I don't know. It's just that I think, again, Lovecraft was having so much difficulty putting things down on paper that he went back to some of his old themes, whether it be psychic possession, which is what the Thing on the Doorstep is about, or this combination of science and superstition, which actually is a very important theme in his, whereby in the Dreams in the Witch House, for example, he reinterprets witchcraft from a scientific perspective, and it does a very interesting job of it. And The Shadow over Innsmouth is really the culmination of, or The Shadow Out of Time. I'm sorry, The Shadow Out of Time is really, with At the Mountains of Madness, the pinnacle of his cosmic writing, where he takes not just the world but the entire universe, and not just the present day but all time as for his perspective. So he just didn't find the opportunity to write about the sea during those few years.
I see. I would have loved to have quite more stories of Lovecraft.
Well, I want to go back to The Shadow over Innsmouth. The way that story came to be written. Lovecraft admits that it was based on the town of Newburyport. Now, it's funny. I don't know if anybody of you have been to Newburyport.
I've been to Newburyport.
Yeah,
I'm too into.
Well, as you know, Newburyport today is a very spruce resort town, very expensive. I imagine. It's impeccable. Still has some good colonial remains, but in Lovecraft's day, it was very different. It was really a very run-down place, not well kept at all. In fact, the first time Lovecraft went there was in 1923 with some young friend of his, and they took a bus, or maybe a trolley actually. They took a trolley there, and they went through the entire town without realizing that was the town that they wanted to explore, because didn't seem to be much there. So then finally they had to come back and actually explore the town. So it was kind of a decaying backwater at the time. So Lovecraft went there in 23, maybe gone there once more a year or two later. But then in 1931, after these rejections that he had, he was fishing around. Sorry, the pun, fishing around for some a theme or an idea to write about. So he went back to Newburyport in the fall of 1931, and that's when he started thinking about The Shadow over Innsmouth. And I'll tell you, that story has a number of important literary influences that may affect how he came to write that story, and specifically about the sea. And one of the most important, of course, is the story Fishhead by Irvin S. Cobb. A great story. Lovecraft actually read that story when it first got published in a magazine in 1911, I believe. That story is about, again, this half human, half catfish person living in, I think it's in the South, I think the state of Kentucky, maybe, I can't quite remember, but clearly in a sort of, river area or marsh or something like that. Incredibly atmospheric story. And Lovecraft was so enthused by this story when he first read it that he wrote a letter to the magazine praising the story, and they published this little letter of his in 1911. One other major influence of this story of Lovecraft's is the story called The Harbor Master by Robert W. Chambers. Now, that story had appeared separately in a magazine in 1897, and then Chambers incorporated it into this sort of episodic novel called In Search of the Unknown in 1904. It's the first 5 chapters of that book. And again, a tremendously evocative story about, again, a single individual, this creature that they call the Harbor Master, half fish, half human, who terrorizes people somewhere. I can't remember where it's set, probably somewhere in the New York area, I think, because that's where Chambers was from. But those 2 stories were very significant in the influencing how Lovecraft came to write The Shadow over Innsmouth. And I think that had something to do with how Lovecraft created things like Devil Reef or that underwater city or whatever. But we should also note that his own story, well, both Dagon and the Temple were sort of,
Rehearsals?
Yeah, they were sort of, the trial runs, as it were, for The Shadow over Innsmouth. Lovecraft did this a lot. He would, broach an idea in a short story, and later on he says, I think I could have done a lot more with that. And so he reused the same idea, but vastly expanded it and made a full-length novella out of it. And that's what he did with The Shadow over Innsmouth, drawing upon these 2 early stories that had a lot of good, interesting things in it, but not fully developed. But they were fully developed in The Shadow over Innsmouth.
Quite right. And I also I think that in The Shadow over Innsmouth, his scopes go from personal to evolutionary. I don't know.
Yes, exactly. Again, in those 2 stories I mentioned, Fishhead and the Harbor Master, you're only dealing with a single case of some sort of aberrant, hybrid human being. And of course, there's no explanation of how that happened. The authors simply accept it as a given. Lovecraft said, no, we have to come up with a reason why there are these hybrid creatures, and Lovecraft involves this idea of mating, humans mating with these alien creatures. And let's be honest, we don't want to get too much into the whole idea of racism that's been talked to death in Lovecraft, but there is obviously a sort of a racist element. What Lovecraft was sort of symbolizing in this union of fish and human was his opposition to what he called what everybody called miscegenation, which is the interbreeding between different human races, and that was considered by many people at the time a bad thing to do. In fact, it was illegal in many states, United States, to do that. Interracial marriage was illegal in many states all the way up to 1967, incredibly enough, until the Supreme Court finally overturned that. So that was a big issue for many people at that time, that the races should remain separate, especially in terms of producing offspring.
We haven't mentioned the Call of Cthulhu at all. Would you like
Yes. Remember, one of the chapters of the Call of Cthulhu is called "The Madness from the Sea." But that's interesting because a lot of people, in part, Lovecraft is to blame for thinking that Cthulhu is some sort of water creature. Well, obviously isn't, because he came from the depths of outer space. He just happens to have been imprisoned in this underwater city of R'lyeh, or however you pronounce it. I'm not sure anybody knows how to pronounce that name, but and even though he sort of looks like an octopus, one shouldn't conclude from that water is somehow the native element of Cthulhu. That's just by happenstance that he's there. So I think Lovecraft provides fairly precise coordinates as to where exactly in the Pacific Ocean Cthulhu is. I don't know what more there is to say about that. It is a pretty remote area of the ocean, and the Pacific Ocean is enormous. But I think he chose that as because nothing is in that area at all, so that's where he could postulate something going on there. And the influences on that story are kind of interesting too. One of the influences, I believe, is A. Merritt's story, The Moon Pool, which again is sort of set, I believe, at least partially in the ocean, where he postulates some sort of a gate or a door that will lead, in the ocean, that will lead you down into the depths of the water. Yeah, I mean, The Call of Cthulhu is certainly a sea horror story, at least in part.
Yes, I would say that this second chapter, I would like to ask, do you think it's well written? I don't know, well written is the question. Realistic written in terms of the ships, the alert, and the I forgot the name of the other vessel.
Vigilant, I think, is the other one. I can't remember.
So you think that the marine theme, I don't know, the sailors, the expeditions, I don't know, there's an encounter, a violent encounter between these two two vessels. So this.
Well, I personally am very ignorant of the sea and ships and nautical stuff like that. So I don't know. I do think there is what Lovecraft does in that story is very clever. He has a deliberately fragmented narration whereby everything that we learn about Cthulhu is indirect until the final revelation, and even that to some degree is indirect. He starts off by this person, whose uncle has died, a professor, and he reads his notes about this Cthulhu cult. He meets with this artist, Henry Wilcox, who has fashioned a bust of Cthulhu in his dreams. Again, very indirect, and then he hears about the meeting of this anthropological society, in which more information is learned about Cthulhu and their various cults all around the earth. And then finally, he comes upon this document that the sailor Johansson has written. But again, even that is an indirect document, because it is simply Johansson's telling of the story in this manuscript. But he goes gradually closer and closer and closer until you actually see Cthulhu in the flesh. So I think that's a very clever way of doing it, because Lovecraft recognized that a creature like that is hard to portray convincingly, unless you have a build-up, a suitable atmospheric build-up that will create a sense of verisimilitude. And I think he accomplishes that in the end, very, very, very skillfully.
Speaking of atmosphere, one of Lovecraft's friend and his executor, Robert H. Barlow, also wrote a very story that's very aware of mood and atmosphere with the night ocean. Could you discuss that?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'll tell you, that has been a great discovery. And Barlow, the more we learn about Barlow, the more amazing he is. Hippocampus Press is about to publish an enormous volume of basically of Barlow's complete writings. We did a selection back in 2004 under the title Eyes of the God. This will have the same title, but this book will be about 500 or 600 pages, including lots more stories, essays, poetry, and I mean, Barlow was tremendously productive and brilliant at a very young age. He grew up, as we know, in Florida, spent most of his life in Florida until he was an adult, and then he went to California first and then to Mexico. So Barlow was living in central Florida inland, but always by a river or something like that. So he was familiar with the sea, and he would go to Daytona Beach a lot, which is a coastal city right on the Atlantic Ocean. So he was well familiar with the sea. And this story, The Night Ocean, indeed is set at some fictitious beach resort town. And I'll tell you, when I first read that story, I said, oh, Lovecraft had to have had a lot of input in this story, because it reads so well. It's hard to imagine a boy of basically 17 or 18 writing a story this accomplished and this mature. And yet, later on, we discovered the actual typed manuscript that Barlow sent to Lovecraft, and then that Lovecraft, revised. But I'll tell you, Lovecraft's revisions were not significant at all. I mean, basically, just in terms of language here and there, I would estimate that at least 90% of that story is Barlow's. So this is a story by Barlow, essentially, with some minimal input by Lovecraft. And again, I don't know how Barlow came up with this story. It's really an amazing creation, and really one of the great stories of that whole era. And should have been published in places like Weird Tales, but it just got published in an amateur magazine, and that was it. But we don't know enough about Barlow to know how he had such an affinity to the sea. But there it is.
I think what makes that work so powerful is just the ambiguity of the narration. You're never sure if what he's seeing is actually something literal or something that's like a figment of his imagination.
That's right. And there are all kinds of symbols in that story. And basically the story is, again, I mean, in the broadest sense, a suggestion there's something out there. Maybe not, maybe there is, but it's basically about how we respond to the external world. Our place in the external world. Do we occupy any significant amount of do we have a role in the world, or is there something out there so vast that makes us insignificant? He may have gotten that from Lovecraft to some degree, but it clearly something that he felt himself, because he couldn't have written that story the way he did if he hadn't had those feelings on his own.
Yeah, I can't help but see some parallels even with the Shadow over Innsmouth. With the
yes, to some degree, although as you say, almost it sounds bad, but almost nothing happens in the story. I mean, but that's actually a good thing. You don't need action of that sort, and you don't need a monster emerging at the end to make an effective horror story. The narrator thinks he saw something, right at the end, maybe a creature, maybe just a human being, who knows, right at the end, but we never learn. And that's good. That kind of artistic restraint is what makes that story much more than just a horror story. It's a story about humanity, really.
Esti, I would like to talk about another author that dwells on the sea too, which is William Hope Hodgson. So what can you tell us about him?
Oh, there's so much now. Last 10 years or so, a lot of work has been done on Hodgson, and we now know much more about him than we did before. Hodgson was an English writer, born 1877, died 1918, early 1918. He was a soldier in World War I and died in Belgium, I believe, Flanders, and is buried there in a war cemetery there. Very sad. He was only 41. Could have done much greater work as a writer, but what he left behind is pretty significant. And he was indeed a sailor early on. He was in the Merchant Marine, I believe it is. And he complains about it. He wrote an article later on saying it was a horrible life because the pay was very bad, the food was bad, and basically these sailors were almost slaves, on these ships, ruled by these captains who didn't really have much interest in them. And he actually, I think, might have gone in front of Parliament to complain about I think so. I can't remember if he says that in that article, or there's something like that. But he wanted to to effect reforms in the Merchant Marine to make the lives of these ordinary sailors better. Initially he thought that he ran away to the sea, as the old boyhood dream of running away and becoming a sailor. That was a common thing back then. And he was very young. I think, did you say he was like 13 years old or something? So he spent, I don't know, may have spent a good 10 years on as a sailor. But then it says, I can't live this way anymore. This is not the life for me. And yet it's pretty clear that the sea meant a lot to him, and he keeps coming back to it over and over again in his stories. The classic story he wrote of the sea, it really is, of course, The Voice in the Night, one of the great horror stories of the 20th century, which is not only a story about the sea and what can come out of it, but this very intense story of a man and his wife who gets stranded, I think, on an island, and can't get food, and then find this strange type of food that they eat, almost like a fungus. It's not clear what it is, that actually ends up corrupting them from within, and they become horrible monsters from eating this substance. It's just a masterful story. And of course, several novels deal with the sea. The Ghost Pirates, The Boats of the Glen Carrig, two of his earlier novels, are all about the sea, set on the sea with on a ship that encounters monsters out there in the Sargasso Sea, and things like that. So he in fact, there are times when his nautical language is so involved that it's hard to understand. For somebody who's not familiar with that language, it's a little difficult to comprehend at times. But nevertheless, a lot of these stories, especially the novels, build to a tremendous climax. He had a good sense of how you start slowly and gradually build up to this powerful climax at the end. So yeah, I think it could be said that Hodgson is probably the greatest writer of sea horror in literary history.
Is there one particular, but besides the short story, The Voices in the Night, is there some other story that really connects with you?
I mean, I think there must be. At the moment, I can't remember them now, but there are a lot of stories. I mean, he wrote stories called The Derelict, The Stone Ship. I mean, his corpus is full of these types of stories. But I think The Voice in the Night definitely is the best one. But there are many others that are well worth reading.
What I find interesting about Hodgson is that, like Lovecraft, he makes like a jump between horror to science fiction, maybe like under the influence of Wells and Verne.
Yep.
But it is very particular that just like Lovecraft, he's a major exponent of science fiction, or it wasn't called science fiction back then, but just he talks about these multiple dimensions and these pathways where there's an intersection of different dimensions that overlap in certain parts. Can you maybe discuss a little bit about the parallels between Hodgson and Lovecraft, and obviously the influence that Lovecraft and the respect that he had for Hodgson?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Hodgson was a pioneering writer, and to some degree, that explains why he didn't get the kind of recognition in his own lifetime. He was sort of well ahead of his time, and most of his books, unfortunately, didn't succeed, didn't sell very well, and he was quite discouraged by that. He wrote his novels actually very early in life, and they took quite a while to get published. We have documentary evidence that in fact the first novel he wrote, incredibly, is The Nightland, this enormous sort of futuristic novel about basically the end of human society. It's with the imminent destruction of the earth, a huge imaginative exercise, but he had real difficulty getting that published. So then he wrote shorter novels like House on the Borderland and The Ghost Pirates, and those did get published, and then finally Nightland got published. But yeah, I don't know that a whole lot of work has been done on tracing the influences of Hodgson. I think you're probably right that H.G. Wells had some significant influence. Wells's great science fiction stories of the 1890s, very popular, were widely read, and Hodgson, no doubt read them. Lovecraft, however, did not read Hodgson until 1934, because again, after his death, Hodgson had basically fallen into obscurity. He was very little read. Nobody even heard of him. But finally, a friend of Lovecraft's named H.C. Koenig came upon these books and said, wow, this is really good stuff, and then started circulating these books to the Lovecraft circle, and that's how Lovecraft read them. But so the influence of Hodgson on Lovecraft is probably not great, but some people have made a good claim that The Shadow Out of Time, with its cosmic vistas, owes something to The House on the Borderland, which is again one segment of it has this incredible kind of a digression about the narrator spanning the cosmic voids, whether in reality or as in imagination, I'm not sure. So that little bit might have influenced Lovecraft, but otherwise it's, Lovecraft read Hodgson so late that it's hard to come up with a clear influence of Lovecraft, except from that one story.
You mentioned that a lot has been written recently about Hodgson. I know that Nightshade Press finally came out with, I guess, the complete fiction of his complete fiction, and I know that also some writers like Sam Gafford wrote a bit about some essays about him. But what do you think are like the important like secondary material that's come out on?
Yeah, there's not that much, I'll tell you, even now. And I was very sad that Sam Gafford, a dear friend of mine, he died in 2019. He was only 56. He could have done a lot more work on Hodgson if he'd lived longer, because he was wanting to do a full scale study, maybe even a biography. Although the evidence, the documentary evidence for Hodgson is just not there. There's just not that much of it. But yeah, I mean, Brian Stableford wrote a fine chapter on Hodgson in one of his books about scientific romance in England. Gafford published at least, I have them here, several issues of his own magazine called Sargasso, 3 or 4 issues at least, that has some really good criticism of Hodgson, either by himself or by others. And there was a British academic named Emily Alder, I think. Is it Alder or Adler? I can't remember. Anyway, I think it's Alder, who wrote a PhD dissertation on Hodgson in around 2010 or thereabouts. I met her when I was in England in 2013, and I was hoping that she would get that dissertation published as a book, because it is a fine, probably the best full-length treatment of Hodgson that there is. But so far as I know, she hasn't published it yet. But so there's plenty of work to do on Hodgson if there are people out there who want to do it.
Sounds promising.
Yeah.
Talking about Hodgson and Lovecraft, they come from different backgrounds towards the sea, referring to the sea. So Lovecraft has, even though he lives on a coastal city, he didn't venture much on the sea, on the proper sea. And Hodgson spent around 8 to 10 years as a marine. I don't know if marine is the right word, as a sailor. So how do you think this affects the literary production of both? How does this set them apart?
Well, yeah, I mean, because Lovecraft didn't have any professional experience being on the sea, to some degree, the sea is sort of more remote to him. I mean, I like to go back to this idea of the threshold. He was a man of the land, as it were. The derogatory term is a landlubber. He didn't. I mean, I wouldn't say he didn't want to venture out into the sea, but so far as I can tell, I don't know if he was ever on a boat. Even not that I can remember. What he did do, I'll tell you.
Nantucket.
Pardon?
Nantucket. He must have taken the ferry.
Oh yeah, of course he would have taken a ferry or something to Nantucket Island in 1934. Yeah, which he loved. And I think there was one point he says, "Oh yeah, at one point there was no land to be seen at all," so he could sort of imagine himself, on the high seas or something. But that's not very much. I mean, frankly, he's still pretty bound by land. So in that sense, the sea was a kind of an other to him. It was out there, and to that degree, it emphasized the sort of alienness of the sea to somebody who's more comfortable on land. Whereas Hodgson, very familiar with the sea, but nevertheless could envision at first hand creatures coming out of the sea, because I believe in some of his nonfiction writing, he actually tells of encountering octopus or squids or whatever, and so then in his fiction he transmutes those real creatures into very much more bizarre creatures coming out of the sea. So each in their own way approach the sea as an element of horror, either through unfamiliarity or through actual familiarity.
Besides Hodgson and the couple of authors you mentioned, Cobb and that What other major authors would you say are important as far as like horror coming from?
Well, I think we have, I mean, we can never ignore Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, and Lovecraft was greatly influenced by not only things like narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which is pretty much a sea horror story, although mostly non-supernatural, except possibly at the end. We don't really know, but you go things like Manuscript Found on a Bottle, which is one of Poe's earliest stories. Tremendous supernatural tale of sea horror, and of course A Descent into the Maelstrom. That is one of the most chilling stories you'll ever read. Again, probably not supernatural, although the way he describes this maelstrom, this cyclone or whatever it is, sounds pretty supernatural to me, but might have been a real event. We're not sure. So you can never ignore Poe. There's another very obscure writer named, again, Lovecraft read him, called William Clark Russell, a British writer from the 1880s, I believe. Wrote at least one novel about the sea. It's called The Frozen Pirate. And there's another one I can't remember the title of, that Lovecraft read, very early on when he was a boy, and that stuck with him for, and one of them is actually about a sea voyage down to the Antarctic, and that probably had some influence on the Mountains of Madness. But in terms of recent writers, well, I'll tell you, I keep wanting to talk about Lovecraft's friend Frank Belknap Long. Born and raised in New York City, lived in New York City his whole life. So, to that degree, he had access to the sea, the harbors, and things like that. And Lovecraft actually encouraged him to write about the sea, because from his earlier writings, Lovecraft could tell that the sea meant a lot to him. We have stories like, Death Waters, The Sea Thing, and his best story, I think, is called Second Night Out, which was published in Weird Tales, I think, in 1934, under this rather lurid title, The Black Dead Thing. But it's a great tale of sea horror, and it was anthologized in an anthology by Alfred Hitchcock, and that's when I first read it, and it totally blew me away. It's a really fine story of horrors from the sea. I don't think Long ever wrote a novel-length work about the sea, but a lot of his short stories deal with. Another one, of course, The Man with the Thousand Legs. That's also a sea horror story. Really a fine piece of work. But I have been trying to think of more recent writers, like, within the last 40, 50 years, who have written about the sea, and I really couldn't come up with, that many, except maybe just, random stories here and there. I mean, can you think of any? It's funny that people don't seem to write about this anymore.
I think most of the influences that I've seen have been old movies that I saw as things. And then I'm wondering if you can think of any writers that they might have taken in either inspiration or adapted their works into cinema.
Yeah.
I imagine they must have gotten some inspiration from Hodgson and possibly.
Perhaps, but I don't know. I mean, it's natural to find horror in the sea, just because, again, it's such an alien environment. I mean, once you're off the land, you're sort of, you're at the mercy of the water, and it's a pretty frightening thing. I myself don't like being off the land myself, so I'll stick to the earth. I can't swim, and I don't think Lovecraft could swim either. I mean, he went to the beach that one time, but I don't think he ever learned how to swim. So probably wouldn't have wanted to actually go into the water.
Talking about the influence of Hodgson on cinema, would you say A Voice in the Night is a precursor of body horror? I don't know, kind of Cronenberg.
Oh, to be sure, although without question, but whether these filmmakers were actually thinking of him is to be doubted. But yeah, he started that tendency of showing how the body can be corrupted from within by things that we take into ourselves. Absolutely. And he's very restrained about how he describes what happens to him, and actually it becomes very poignant. When you see your own wife kind of decaying in front of you. Well, it's a horrible thing to see. I mean, it's dreadful. And he himself, the narrator, who's the husband also experiences the same phenomenon, and then but they stick to each other. It's actually becomes very poignant, because what do they have now? They have only themselves now left, because they have been so so tainted that's all that's left to them is each other. Very, very well done story.
So, besides From Boys in the Night, what other stories would you recommend us to experience the horrors from the sea?
Well, I've mentioned several of them already, but somebody should really do a whole anthology of the Hodgson stories that are set in the sea, because he wrote a lot of stuff. I mean, there are 5 volumes of Hodgson, published in this edition, and let's be honest, some are better than others. I mean, like almost all writers, he kind of wrote too much, and so the really good stuff of Hodgson can be probably put into one volume, and and I'm sure there have been anthologies of sea horror tales, by many different authors. I don't recall them at hand, but there must be out there. So there are plenty of good stories about the sea, and it's an endlessly inexhaustible terrain for horror stories.
I don't know, guys, if you have another question to pose to Mr. Joshi. So seize the moment, because we have him
Well,
here.
I think Rick has vanished. I don't see his image there anymore. But,
You don't see him?
I think he had some problem with his camera, his connection. So.
Could you talk? Could you speak, Rick?
There he is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you hear me? Yeah, excellent. Yes, I have a question. I think it's, but there's a good, and it's difficult to create imaging of the creatures that Lovecraft built in his work. And I want to know if you know, if you consider there are illustrator or illustrators that captured the essence of the Lovecraftian creatures.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because when Lovecraft stories appeared in Weird Tales, the magazine, I mean, they just didn't have very good artists, and Lovecraft was always complaining about how poor their illustrations were, until right at the end, the great artist Virgil Finlay, he was in touch with Virgil Finlay right about the end of his life, and Finlay really one of the great weird artists of our time, and of his time anyway. And he and well beyond Lovecraft's lifetime, he did some great work. I think he's probably one of the 2 or 3 best illustrators of Lovecraft out there. Hannes Bach did a couple of things. He didn't certainly specialize in Lovecraftian horror, but there are famous paintings that, or illustrations that he did of, say, Pickman's model that really evoke Goya, the great Spanish painter, that famous image of Saturn devouring his children, which basically Bach adapted in painting Pickman's model. I'll tell you, there was a really, really good book that came out some years ago called, let me see, I have it up there. It's called a Lovecraft Retrospective, which is almost a sort of history of Lovecraft illustration over the years. I'm sorry to say it's a very expensive book now, especially that it's out of print. And it's an enormous book, a coffee table book, but that has some magnificent illustrations. And it is surprising that some of the best illustrations actually appear in these comic books. Some comic book illustrators like Bernie Wrightson and Bob Eggleton, they have done some outstanding Lovecraft illustrations in the course of adapting Lovecraft into comic form. And so they're good illustrators out there, and actually overseas there are several good ones. The French illustrator Philippe Drouillet did a great book called Démons et Merveilles, Demons and Marvels, in France, that was a selection of Lovecraft stories illustrated by him, and that is a tremendous volume if you can pick that up. I think this artist Breccia, I don't know how you pronounce his name exactly. Argentinian? Is he Argentinian?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, he did a great book of, at least one book of Lovecraftian, kind of a graphic novel that has some magnificent stuff in it. So there's really good Lovecraftian art out there if you just kind of hunt for it.
What do you think about the Haute Patel illustrations of, again, The Shadow of Berinsmouth?
They're a bit on the crude side, although they're kind of evocative. Lovecraft actually liked them. They're sort of they're woodcuts, I think. And you know, Lovecraft, that whole project was a fiasco. I mean, it was a very bad job. You know, his publisher was just an amateur. He didn't really know what he was doing. But Lovecraft did think that the Haute Patel illustrations were among the best things in that book. And then he went on, you know, to do some really good work. The volume Collected Poems has a number of paintings or drawings by Haute Patel, especially regarding that sonnet cycle fungi from Yuggoth. And those are magnificent. That book was in production for a long time because Haute Patel took so long to get these illustrations, but it was well worth waiting for. It finally came out in 1963, and great book. I personally, by the way, I don't care for the illustrations of Lee Brown Coy. I know he has many supporters out there. A lot of people like Coy's work. It doesn't do anything for me. I find it a little on the crude side, but you know, Coy did a lot of Lovecraft illustrations also. And as I say, some people like them, some people don't.
I don't know, guys, if you have any other questions to Mr. Joshi. Okay, Rick?
Yeah, I have one more. I am really fascinated about how Lovecraft introduced the tradition knowledge, mythology and archaic traditions in his work. And the question is, you think there is a special mythology or tradition, a culture, archaic civilization that influence in this creation of the creatures to relations? Can you relate with this cults and these strange gods and creatures? Did you find something that considered influence to connect with this?
Yeah, that's very hard to say. Lovecraft knew a lot about, you know, these different mythological traditions, but I think the one that he came upon first, which is of course the Greco-Roman tradition, actually had quite a bit to do with the creation of what came to be called the Cthulhu mythos, especially the idea of humans intermingling with other creatures or gods or whatever. That's right out of Greek mythology. That's a staple theme of Greek mythology, where a lot of the great heroes of Greek mythology, whether they be Hercules or Achilles or whoever, are explicitly stated to be the offspring of gods mating with human women mostly. And so I think that idea certainly came from Greco-Roman myth. But Lovecraft, you know, had a lot of knowledge of things like Norse myth. I think that influenced him to some degree. The Aztec myth, I think he knew something about that, not a lot, but he had some knowledge of that. You know, primitive myth out of you know, the Middle Ages, or even going back farther in time, the Celtic myths, things like that. Some people think that might have influenced him. But I think in this regard, we have to remember Lovecraft's atheism, because in that sense he regarded these cults as misguided, you know, as under a delusion, which because he felt that all religion is a delusion, you know. And so when somebody like Castro in the Call of Cthulhu tells this story about the old ones and the worship of the old ones, Lovecraft suggests that he is actually mistaken, that because Castro is trying to say, oh, there's, you know, we're worshiping them, and then when they take over the earth, we'll be alongside with them. Well, not very likely. If the old ones do take over, they'll wipe out their own worshippers along with everybody else. So these people are actually deluded or misguided in thinking that they are somehow going to be the chosen people of the old ones, and that idea comes from Lovecraft's atheism.
Thank you so much, Steve. Steve, would you like to add something else so we can wrap this up to the audience, which is going to be a lot of, I'm sure of it.
Well, I'll tell you, I've been involved with Lovecraft work for a long time, 30, 40 years or more even. And I wouldn't say I'm winding it up, but one of the major projects I'm finally coming to a conclusion is the complete publication of Lovecraft's letters. And I think everybody out there deserves or should read as many Lovecraft letters as they can. We are publishing them in something like 20, 25 volumes from Hippocampus Press, an enormous quantity of material. They really shed tremendous light on Lovecraft, both good and some bad, but we all know that. But you really get a sense of what Lovecraft was like as a human being and as a writer from these letters. And that helps you then understand his fiction so much better. So the one thing I can recommend everybody, try to read those letters to get a real insight into Lovecraft's mind.